The king's daughter, a life destroyed by imperial pride. The banquet that sealed her fate. In the scorching summer of 479 BCE, within the sprawling gardens of the royal palace at Persepolis, a 7-day feast roared to life. Wine flowing from artificial fountains, musicians playing instruments looted from conquered lands, and dancers weaving between massive stone columns. King Xerxes I of Persia had returned from his catastrophic Greek campaign, defeated at Salamis and Plataea, yet determined to reassert his absolute power through displays of wealth and dominance that would make the world forget his military humiliation. Thousands of guests from across the vast Persian Empire filled colossal halls draped with Babylonian silks and Lydian gold. For 3 days, the celebration continued without pause, a desperate performance of invincibility by a king whose army had been shattered by Greek spears. On the 3rd day, something happened that would destroy a young life before it truly began. Xerxes, drunk not merely on wine, but on the intoxicating delusion of unlimited power, watched his 14-year-old daughter Amestris dancing among the guests. In that moment of autocratic delirium, he made a decision that would condemn her to decades of unrelenting suffering. The gilded cage of Persian royalty. To understand the magnitude of this personal tragedy, we must first grasp what it meant to be the great king of Persia at the empire's zenith. Xerxes ruled territories stretching from Libya to the Indus Valley, from Thrace to Ethiopia, commanding approximately 50 million subjects from dozens of different peoples. The Greek historian Herodotus, who lived just 1 generation after these events and interviewed Persians who had served in Xerxes' court, described a system of power so absolute that the king's will was literally indisputable law. Within the palace walls, this absolutism became even more extreme. The royal family lived under rigid protocols that regulated every aspect of existence: whom they could speak to, when they could eat, where they could go. Women of the royal family, particularly the great king's daughters, were considered imperial property, more valuable than gold treasures. Their lives, their bodies, were instruments of dynastic policy to be deployed at the king's whim. Young Amestris, not to be confused with her mother of the same name, Xerxes' principal wife, notorious for legendary cruelty, was the daughter of a secondary concubine at court, a woman of Bactrian blood according to preserved Persian text fragments. Even by the cultivated standards of the Persian court, where beauty was refined as an art form, Amestris was described as exceptionally lovely. She grew up in the imperial harem, the women's quarters of the palace, educated by eunuchs and older concubines in the arts expected of a Persian princess: dance, music, poetry, embroidery. Sources suggest that Xerxes held special affection for this daughter, keeping her close even when other daughters were sent away to distant satrapies for dynastic marriages. This paternal favoritism, which might have seemed a blessing, would prove to be her curse. The fatal promise. The decisive moment at the 479 BCE banquet is documented in multiple Greek and Persian sources, with variations in detail but consistency in essence. Herodotus offers the most detailed version, based supposedly on testimonies from Persian courtiers who later went into exile in Greece. According to this account, Xerxes, after days of continuous drinking and surrounded by sycophants who reinforced his sense of omnipotence, publicly announced that he would grant any request made by any guest, sealing the promise with an oath by the Persian gods. This impulsive pledge was a catastrophic error for Amestris, for it captured the attention of Artabanus, an aging general who had served both Xerxes and his father Darius. A man over 60 years old who had lost his 3 previous wives, Artabanus sought to consolidate his position at court through a marriage alliance with the royal family. Artabanus, Seizing upon Xerxes' public promise and calculating that the drunken king, surrounded by witnesses, could not refuse without losing face, made his request, the hand of Princess Amestris in marriage. Silence crashed over the hall like a physical force. Guests glanced nervously between Artabanus and Xerxes, conscious of the extreme audacity of the request. Persian royal princesses rarely married subjects at all, and when they did, it was to young princes of noble lineages, not to aging generals, however honored. But Xerxes had made a public oath, and to refuse would be to admit that his word was not absolute. An unthinkable display of weakness for a great king, especially after his recent military defeat in Greece. Sources describe Xerxes turning pale, gripping the arms of his throne, looking around like a trapped animal. After long minutes of tense silence, he pronounced a single word: granted. A daughter's desperate plea. Amestris was present at the banquet, witnessing the transaction that sealed her fate. Fragmentary Persian texts preserved in later compilations suggest that she attempted to plead with her father afterward in private, begging him to find some way to annul the promise. But Xerxes, trapped between his paternal love and his need to maintain the image of absolute power and infallibility, chose image over daughter. He rationalized the decision through political logic. Artabanus, as a veteran general and powerful figure at court, could become a threat if publicly humiliated. Granting him a wife from the royal family would make him a dynastically bound ally. Xerxes, perhaps to ease his own guilt, convinced himself he was making a politically prudent choice, sacrificing one daughter's happiness for the empire's stability. Repeating to himself the mantra of every autocrat, the good of the state supersedes personal considerations. The marriage was celebrated 3 months later with pomp appropriate to a royal princess. But witnesses described the ceremony as a spectacle of disguised grief. Amestris, dressed in silks and jewels worth more than entire cities, moved through the rituals like a trained automaton, barely concealing her underlying horror. Artabanus, by contrast, displayed triumphant satisfaction, having won not just a young and beautiful wife, but also a permanent connection to the Achaemenid bloodline. The age difference between them was approximately 50 years, Amestris at 14, Artabanus over 60. Even in a society where marriages between older men and very young women were common, this disparity caused discomfort. Comments were whispered in palace corridors about the cruelty of Xerxes in sacrificing his daughter to save face. The prison of marriage. The first months of marriage quickly revealed that Amestris had been condemned to an existence of profound suffering. Artabanus, obsessed with his young wife as a possession to be controlled and displayed, kept her in almost complete isolation. Sources describe how he forbade Amestris from visiting her family quarters in the palace or even communicating with her sisters and mother. This separation from family was particularly cruel in Persian culture, where female family bonds were the primary source of emotional support and social identity for court women. Amestris was effectively imprisoned in Artabanus's quarters, watched by servants loyal to the general, with no freedom of movement or autonomy of any kind. Preserved correspondence fragments suggest she tried to send secret messages to her father, pleading for intervention. But Xerxes, ashamed perhaps of his decision, yet incapable of reversing it without admitting error, never responded. The most disturbing aspect of Artabanus's treatment of Amestris involved his conjugal expectations and his pathological desire to produce an heir of royal Achaemenid blood. Multiple sources allude, with the characteristic modesty of ancient texts when discussing sexual matters, to the fact that Artabanus, despite his advanced age, subjected Amestris to frequent and forced conjugal demands, obsessed with the idea of siring a son who would carry imperial blood. Court physicians were consulted, Records preserved in cuneiform administrative tablets from the palace show payments to fertility specialists, purchases of herbs and substances believed to increase chances of conception. Amestris was treated not as a wife, but as a reproductive tool, her body a territory to be colonized to produce an heir who would consolidate Artabanus's position in the imperial hierarchy. The child she never wanted. 3 years after the marriage, in 476 BCE, Amestris finally became pregnant. Artabanus exulted, ordering celebrations and making grandiose offerings to the Persian gods. But for Amestris, the pregnancy represented additional horror. She knew that if she produced the heir Artabanus desired, she would be permanently chained to him. Mothers of royal-blooded children were never permitted to divorce or escape their marriages. Sources describe a pregnancy marked by profound melancholy. Servants reported that Amestris spent hours staring through the windows of her quarters toward the gardens where she had danced before her marriage, weeping silently. She frequently refused to eat, needing to be forced by servants, alarmed for her health. In the 9th month, she entered labor that lasted 2 days, an agonizing period documented by court midwives who later testified about the complications. The son who was born, a boy whom Artabanus immediately named Xerxes in honor of his imperial grandfather, was weak and sickly. Physicians expressed concerns about his chances of survival, but Artabanus, blinded by ambition, ignored the warnings and planned elaborate ceremonies to present the child to the court. These ceremonies never occurred. 10 days after birth, the baby died. Medical records preserved attribute the death to respiratory complications, but rumors circulated through the court suggesting more sinister causes. Some whispered that Amestris, in desperation, had suffocated her own child to free herself from the prison of marriage. Others claimed that servants loyal to the princess, horrified by her suffering, had deliberately neglected the infant. No conclusive evidence exists for either theory, but the rumors reveal the court's perception that the marriage was so cruel that even infanticide would be understandable as a form of escape. The descent into hell. The baby's death triggered a terrible transformation in Artabanus. Consumed by suspicions that Amestris had somehow caused the child's death, he became progressively more abusive and controlling. Witnesses reported screams coming from Artabanus's quarters. Servants observed Amestris with visible bruises on her face and arms. On one occasion, according to a preserved account, Artabanus beat Amestris so violently that she was bedridden for weeks. When she finally recovered physically, something had broken psychologically. Servants described a profound change in Amestris. The young woman who had tried to plead, to escape, to resist in small ways, now existed in a state of deep apathy. She moved through her days like a ghost, speaking rarely, eating only when forced, spending hours motionless staring at nothing. Xerxes, informed about his daughter's deterioration, finally confronted the magnitude of his paternal betrayal. Sources suggest he tried to intervene discreetly, summoning Artabanus and ordering him to treat Amestris with more gentleness. But his moral authority on this matter was null. Artabanus, now connected to the royal family by marriage and aware that Xerxes had sacrificed his daughter to avoid losing face, had leverage of his own. He responded to Xerxes' admonitions with subtle reminders that the king himself had consented to the marriage, that the treatment of a wife was her husband's prerogative according to Persian law. To question this would be to question the very traditions that sustained imperial power. Xerxes, trapped in a snare of his own making, retreated. Amestris would remain with Artabanus, and her suffering would continue without intervention. Blood in the palace. In 465 BCE, 14 years after Amestris's marriage, a dramatic event altered the situation. Xerxes was assassinated in a palace coup led by Artabanus and co-conspirators. The coup's motivations were complex, involving succession disputes and court factionalism. But some sources suggest that the treatment of Amestris played a role in Artabanus's justifications. He allegedly argued that Xerxes had become a weak tyrant, that his willingness to sacrifice his own daughter demonstrated a lack of the moral judgment necessary to rule. This perverse logic, using the suffering of Amestris that Artabanus himself had caused as justification for killing her father, demonstrates the depths of the general's sociopathy. The coup was initially successful, with Artabanus controlling the palace for 7 months. But eventually, Xerxes' son Artaxerxes gathered loyal forces and crushed the rebellion. Artabanus was executed, killed by the royal guard in a violent confrontation within the palace itself. A liberation. Too late. Amestris' liberation through Artabanus's death should have been a moment of joy, but sources suggest she was beyond any capacity for joy. At 28 years old, after 14 years of abusive marriage, Amestris was described by contemporaries as a woman who appeared much older, with prematurely grey hair and an expression of permanent absence. Artaxerxes, her half-brother, and now great king, tried to reintegrate her into court life, offering her honorable quarters and freedom. But Amestris rarely left her rooms, refusing to participate in banquets or ceremonies. Servants reported that she spent days in silence, sometimes not speaking a single word for weeks. On one occasion, when musicians were sent to entertain her, they began playing a melody she had danced to at that fateful banquet in 479 BCE. Amestris screamed for the first time in years and destroyed the musicians' instruments. Then she collapsed, weeping uncontrollably. And Dun, the slow death Amestris, died in 457 BCE at 36 years old, from causes that sources describe vaguely as prolonged illness. Modern physicians, analyzing preserved symptom descriptions, suggest the possibility of slow suicide through refusal of food, a form of death that allowed the victim to maintain some dignity and final control over her fate. Other analyses suggest profound depression that led to progressive physical deterioration. Whatever the immediate medical cause, it was clear to contemporaries that Amestris had not died in 457, but decades earlier, at that banquet in 479, when her father, drunk on power and wine, sacrificed her to preserve his image of infallibility. The body that finally stopped functioning in 457 was merely the shell of a person who had been destroyed psychologically and emotionally long before. Erased from history. The story of Amestris was largely forgotten by official Persian history. Royal Achaemenid inscriptions never mention her. Xerxes is remembered for his military campaigns, for building Persepolis, for his conflict with the Greeks, not for destroying his daughter. Only in Greek sources, particularly Herodotus and later chroniclers who compiled Persian oral traditions, were fragments of her tragedy preserved. And even in these sources, her story is often secondary, mentioned as an example of Persian court excesses or the caprice of Oriental tyrants, not fully recognized as the individual tragedy of a young woman destroyed by absolute paternal power and an old man's ambition. Drew the legacy of absolute power. Today, examining the preserved fragments about Amestris in Greek and Persian texts, reading cuneiform inscriptions from palace archives that document payments to physicians and servants in her quarters, we can reconstruct a life marked by suffering that began with an impulsive decision by a father too powerful to reconsider. The story of Amestris compels us to recognize a form of family violence that transcends cultures and eras. The sacrifice of children on the altar of paternal ego, political power, or public image. Xerxes did not beat Amestris. He did not torture her physically. He did not order her execution, but he destroyed her as completely as any torturer through a single decision to prioritize his image of infallibility over his daughter's well-being. This is the violence of absolute power, not directed at enemies, but exercised upon those most vulnerable within the family structure. Xerxes possessed the power to conquer nations, command millions, build monuments that would survive millennia. But when that same power was applied to decisions about his daughter's fate, without moderation from law, custom, or compassion, it became an instrument of personal destruction. The tragedy of a mistress is the tragedy of all those who live under systems where one individual's caprice can destroy lives without possibility of recourse or justice. Her story, preserved in fragments across 2,500 years, serves as a reminder that the greatest horrors do not always occur on battlefields or in torture chambers, but sometimes in decisions made by powerful fathers at drunken banquets. Decisions from which they refuse to retreat out of pride, condemning their children to lives of interminable suffering. The gilded halls of Persepolis still stand partially in the Iranian desert, silent witnesses to the empire's glory and its victims. Among those ruins, if you listen carefully to the wind moving through the broken columns, you might hear the echo of a girl who once danced in those gardens, before her father's word destroyed her future in a single, irreversible moment of imperial vanity.